The Pennsylvania Railroad was a huge American Class 1 railroad that loved to compete with absolutely anybody when it came to almost all markets. They competed with so many railroads like the B&O, the Reading, and the New York Central. One of these markets they competed in was power. When it came to powerful locomotives, the PRR certainly had a lot of attempts. Some were successful, some not so much. They also competed in terms of how much freight was delivered at once. With this, they built many unique locomotives specifically for long-haul freight jobs. Some successful examples being the H6 class and the J1 class, both lasting many years in service before eventually being replaced by diesels and scrapped. However, the PRR didn't just have steam and diesel locomotives, they also had one of the largest electric rail networks in the Northeast, having the Northeast Corridor, which is still America's busiest rail line, and a large enough electrified network specifically for freight trains. This came with some of the most successful electric locomotives in American history, like the GG1, the DD1, and the MP54, which was an electric multiple unit designed for commuter service. Speaking of PRR's electric locomotives, there were certainly some unique examples outside of the successful ones. One specific one was the lone unit of her class, being that she was an experimental locomotive. She was great at her job, however, this turned out to be a bad thing. This is the story of the Pennsylvania Railroad's FF1. In the 1910s, the Pennsy was massively expanding their fleet in order to keep up with other railroads when it came to the freight and passenger market. Their steam fleet was rapidly expanding, and they were still trying out this whole electrification idea. As early as 1895, electrification had been attempted, with the first example of which being a simple 500-volt direct current trolley system that ran for 7 miles. It stopped just 6 years later after the main maintenance shop blew up. A few years later, in 1906, their South Jersey subsidiary called the West Jersey and Seashore Railroad built a third-rail 600-volt DC system from Camden to Millville and Atlantic City via Newfield. Like an interurban or trolley system, the line utilized overhead wire in congested areas like Camden, but also had several installations in the countryside as a way to test the durability of trolley wire versus third rail at higher speeds. Their first electric locomotive was built in 1905 called the AA1. Originally meant to serve as a testbed, they wound up lasting all the way until the 1930s according to Wikipedia. They were mainly used in the extremely busy tunnels between Midtown Manhattan and New Jersey. While they were unstable at certain speeds, the competing experimental locomotive called the Odd D number 10003 wound up being a better suit because of its stability. The latter unit wound up being the inspiration for the successful DD1 locomotives. However, these were only used in the passenger market. Over in the freight market, it's a completely different story. With the success of the DD1s, the PRR decided to try out an electric freight locomotive for their fast freight market. So they built the FF1 locomotive in 1917. The prototype was numbered 3931 and was named Big Liz by the crews. And let's just say, this locomotive was absolutely massive. She was designed to be a helper engine for the heavy freight trains traversing the Allegheny Mountain Range. Big Liz had a 2662 wheel arrangement on 2 frames connected in the center. From a standpoint, it may look like a 2882, but that's not the case. See, each frame had a pair of 3-phase alternate current induction motors driving a jack shaft through gearing and a spring drive. Side rods then drove the wheels. The jack shafts were commonly mistaken for an additional 4th axle, but the quote-unquote wheels are technically cog wheels to transfer power from the motors to the jack shaft. According to Wikipedia, 3-phase power for the 4 massive motors was supplied from the single-phase overhead supply via a large rotary converter housed in the body of the locomotive. Combined rated horsepower of the motors was an absolutely gargantuan 7,640 horsepower. But the converter could only supply a short-term 4,600 horsepower or a continuous 4,000. For 1917, this was still considered ridiculously powerful. Being that Big Liz was a helper engine, she wasn't very fast, mostly because she just wasn't designed for it. Despite the amount of sheer power stored in this thing, it could barely move past 20 miles per hour. However, given that she was almost always in the mountains, these speeds were considered just enough to drag heavy freight trains up and down steep grades. Unfortunately, with the 3-phase induction motors, there was no actual way to control the speed. There were only two speed zones provided, 10.3 miles per hour and 20.6 miles per hour. Because of this power, the FF1 was a workable engine, but the power quickly got the best of her. See, with this amount of power, she had a whopping tractive effort of 140,000 pounds. Anytime she tried to pull a train, her coupler would reportedly snap in half. When acting as a pusher engine, she would sometimes throw the cars off the tracks, causing a derailment. The FF1, as I said, was still a workable locomotive, pushing heavy trains up and down the Allegheny Mountains. She was good at her job, but a little too good to the point where it became dangerous. Given that there was only one example ever built, it's hard to say if the FF1 was successful or not, but I must say again, she was an experimental prototype. Because of Big Liz being way too powerful and overpowered at her job, she still served for a good 23 years before being sidelined in 1940 and eventually scrapped without the possibility of preservation. At the time she was scrapped, the much more successful GG1 locomotives had already taken over. They took care of high-speed, long-distance luxury passenger trains, select regional trains, and long-haul freight trains across the Northeast Corridor. They wouldn't wind up fully retiring until the mid-1980s, when the last run was held on New Jersey's North Jersey coastline. I want to say that the FF1 was indeed successful, but the success was so massive that it had a negative turn, given how it would sometimes mess up horrifically on the job for being ridiculously overpowered. I feel like this locomotive can somewhat define the phrase suffering from success. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. FF1 was a unique electric locomotive originally built as an experiment by the PRR. While it was good at its job, it was massively overpowered, and thus this had a negative turn on the locomotive itself. The sheer power caused it to mess up horribly on some jobs. While it was overpowered, it was still a good locomotive, and wound up serving on the PRR for over 20 years before eventually being scrapped. Let me know what you guys think of this locomotive story in the comments. Thank you all for watching this video, and as always, I won't ask you to subscribe, but I hope to see you in my next video. Have a good day.